Hello, welcome to honest-wargamer. I'm your host, Rob. Welcome to Stream Sheet Day 167. As I know you are all very excited, in 2 days it will be 169, and it will be a fun time. Today I'm joined by, I'm going to get this right, Alistair. I think I got it, maybe I didn't. Oh, thank you. Thank you. And we are
better than my girlfriend.
Yes! That's what I've always wanted to hear. And we are going to be having some big brain, full bumpy brain conversations about Warhammer, which is going to be very interesting. And we're going to get to know Alistair, and we're going to get to just talk amongst ourselves. So I want to say big love to everyone who's joined us live. So Datcom, Mr. Tiga, Ziggy, Helgamar, I got it right, Squinty Hugh, Pragmatic, thanks very much. And I want to say thank you to everyone on Patreon. Couldn't do it without you. Literally, you feed me, so thank you. And I want to say thank you to everyone on the podcast. I'm sorry that all of the podcasts have been a bit delayed recently, but I promise I'll get them up today. So, Alistair, can you introduce yourself? Hi, you're a hobbyist. Who are you? Where are you from? What's going on?
I like long walks on the beach. I like much the same way as everyone else. I've been into the hobby for years and years now. I've been in since I was about 10. So, it's kind of hard to separate yourself from the hobby in some ways. But yeah, I work in career development. I'm doing a master's in career development, and and I kind of mostly play 30k. Mostly play Kill Team, and I'm doing a bit of 40k at the minute, so I'm starting to paint some models up for that. But that's kind of very quick rundown of me.
Okay, good. So I'm going to have to take you through all of the boring questions, but they're very important to humanize you in the context.
Okay.
So sorry, what?
Not just some kind of academic robot or something.
No, we need you to be a person before we can believe what you say. So when did you get into the hobby, and how did you get into the hobby?
Yeah, so I have kind of a slightly different way of getting into the hobby than everyone else I know. So the first interaction I ever had with the hobby is I went to a secondhand bookshop, aged about 8 or 9, I think, and I'd had really bad dyslexia up until that point, and I basically just cracked like fucking reading, and so I was just like looking for books, excited about reading stuff. And I picked up the second edition books for Space Wolves, Ultramarines, and Tyranids.
Yeah.
And basically just like read them cover to cover. So like I didn't know. I knew there were miniatures, but I didn't know kind of anything about the game or anything about the hobby or anything like that. I literally just knew the kind of narrative and the lore and the aesthetics of everything. And then, like my childminder was, I know these. My son used to do them. There's a Games Workshop in town. So I was like, oh, right, I'll go into there. And I kind of went into there, and basically they said, look, he's 8, you can't be doing this yet. Come back when you're a bit older. So, I basically just, from about the age of like 8 to about 12, my sole interaction with Warhammer was just like reading those books and endlessly kind of thumbing through them. And then I kind of got back into the hobby, properly into the hobby age 12, when I finally passed the limit and I was allowed to be kind of in there and stuff. Mm-hmm. Kind of, it's been fairly unbroken since then. I probably left about 16, came back about 18, so I only had about a 2-year break. So I know some people have longer breaks. And ever since then, I've kind of, for me, the thing that I've always really loved is the kind of narrative and the lore and stuff. And so I'm a big 30k player. I've got a big Sons of Horus army, big White Scars army. And I did have a big Iron Warriors army. Like I tend to go through a process of just kind of selling stuff on about a 5-year cycle. So once an army gets about 5 years old, I tend to move on. So it kind of means that although I've been into the hobby for like 2/3 of my life, the amount of miniatures and models I have is actually quite small compared to what I know some people have.
It's a brave thing that you're doing. It's not something I can do. Like I'm still holding on to them, and I'm like, come on.
I'm quite callous in that way in some ways. Like I'm super into something, and then suddenly I'll stop and just move on, and it's dead to me. So like, you know, my girlfriend like lives in fear of me just doing that to her at some point in the future. Of just kind of like, I've moved on. You're finished now.
I think at this stage I've comfortably put more time into some of my armies than I ever have my romantic relationships. So like that's a telling indictment that I think maybe you could put into some research at some point in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Anyway, well, that's interesting. I think that's really, and also I have a similar entry into 40k as you did, whereas I actually went through the narrative of the Horus Heresy into the Horus Heresy game into 40k, having still played. Well, starting off with Warhammer Fantasy Battles, then moving into Age of Sigmar. So I think it is interesting when you do kind of transition from that narrative stuff. And also, just a little side point, again, I've been kind of advocating for living rulebooks being online in a digital format, but someone did raise to me the point, and I think it's clarified there in what you said, that having just some like codexes or battle tomes lying around at your house, they're fascinating things for children to pick up. Like, I think that Warhammer art is incredibly evocative, and like it drives us and motivates us quite a lot more. And I know for a fact that it's something that I like, but I think it's a good argument for paper books, which I don't like. Trying to be healthy.
Yeah, yeah, but... I know what you mean, but I mean, I imagine people are interacting with things in a much different way now. So you know, if you've got kids effectively who are kind of growing up with iPads and interacting with iPads, you know. If you can get that same effect of kind of diving in deep into the kind of aesthetics and the art and stuff, but through a digital format, then I'm all for that. And you know, plus it saves the planet. So I'd counter that argument really that you need paper books for that kind of effect. But I think you know there is that element of nostalgia. I think for hobbyists our age and probably even slightly younger than us in some ways. But I think the world is moving on from that.
Yeah, which I think is fair. Like, okay, all right. Well, so let's get onto the subject for today because I think it's quite interesting. So maybe you give me the elevator pitch on the subject that we're doing, and then we can break it in.
Sure, no worries. So I am doing a master's in career development at the minute, and as part of that, there's 2 research projects I need to do. There's one small, one large. The small is the one I've done. The large is the one I'm about to do. So my small research project was on how people's career development, and this is using the concept of career in quite a large way. So it's not just the job that you have, you know, so you're a lawyer, career development in quite a large way in terms of, you know, who you are, how you relate to the world, how you relate to the idea of what kinds of jobs are available to you, how you find out about those jobs, all that stuff. Is included in career development. That's what I study on my master's. And so my research project is linking tabletop wargaming with that idea of kind of career and career development. So that's kind of not been researched before. So, you know, in a really quick kind of elevator pitch kind of way, you know, I kind of found that the hobby has quite a large and quite profound impact actually on people's careers, and there's a whole variety of different reasons for that. You know, I think there's 5 key areas, and again, I suppose we'll go into depth on these later, but the 5 key areas I found were kind of socialization and community building, community interaction and career development, this idea of a self-concept, skill development was a particularly large one, and then kind of transitioning into new workplaces. Like those were the kinds of things that I was discovering through my research.
Well, can I give you, because I've read it today, and I would like to just point out to everyone that I think it's fascinating, genuinely fascinating, and I really enjoyed the read today, so thank you very much. I mean, I know you did it for yourself, but thanks for sharing it at least, and for coming on the show to talk about it, because I'm very excited to touch on it. I'd also like to prefix this with a conversation I had once with Scrubby and Wells on his podcast, which is the first podcast I actually went on to do after I left Games Workshop, and specifically that's because Scrubby's main point was he feels that Warhammer for him led him down a really positive, from childhood into adulthood, led him down a really positive path, really helped him become, and I think at one point he was an advisor in the White House, I think was one of his jobs. So and I know people who are both very successful. I don't really think like your paycheck really denotes like your value as a person, but people who've been successful in many walks of life, be they carpenters to CEOs. So, and I think Warhammer has sometimes really helped that, but that's my kind of anecdotal conversational thing. Did you end up having any of those conversations or hearing about any of those things before you got into doing this research? Is that what inspired it?
Yeah, so I mean, the reason why I kind of got into the research is because I mean, I guess there's two reasons. So the first is that I think you should live your life in a way that gives you an excuse to do cool stuff. So I wanted to explore the tabletop hobby in more depth. The research project was an excuse to do that, so I did that. I think the second thing is, as you say, certainly in my life, anecdotally with people I know, obviously anecdotally with people we know that the hobby has a huge impact on people's lives and can in quite a big way. But if I was going to say that, I'd want to back that up somehow, and it just adds a level of academic rigor to those kinds of statements and that kind of thing. So yeah, I think for me it was about wanting to think about, okay, well, this is my experience, these are my thoughts about the hobby. Is this kind of more universal? Is this something that is just in my head, or is it kind of a real thing? And so you kind of, the idea of research is you're just kind of discovering something new, Yeah. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but kind of those are my thoughts going in. And so, I didn't go in a blank canvas, as it were. I had some ideas about how the hobby might have impacted people's lives, and that then kind of led me down a certain route with my research.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think that's all good. Big shout out to everyone who's just joined us, by the way. So I'm very happy to be here. Also, thank you to Ignaz for joining our Patreon. Appreciate that tons. And Serenity in the chat says, I honestly think the hobby has helped me out professionally. Army List building has definitely helped me with proofreading and numeracy, which is true. I now know what average of dice rolls at least is. And as we all know, I'm becoming a better human being by conversing better. So those are some of my takeaways. So how did you, do you want to talk about how you approached this, or do you want to talk about what you learned, or after
so I think it might be useful to run through the process of a research project. So regardless of what you're researching, whether it's you're researching kind of cataclysmic variable stars in space, or 17th century crop rotations, or tabletop wargaming. So basically, what you do is you come at the research with some ideas. So it could be really firm ideas, so you have a really specific theory you're looking to test, or it could be the case that you have an area you want to look into, and you just want to learn about that and understand that in a deeper way. So you'll come into that. Then the next step you'll do is you'll look at the literature. So that is basically looking at previous academic work and seeing what other people have said, basically, and so that way you're learning a bit more about the area you're choosing to research, but B, what you're doing is you're situating your research within that larger body. So I'm sure you'll appreciate this with kind of what you do on the Honest Wargamer and the Table Sports Network. What you don't want to do is exactly replicate something that already exists, because that already exists.
Yes.
Either you want to, so say something already exists, a piece of research already exists in the area that you're interested in, you might want to pick holes in that and say, well, actually, I think they've interpreted this in an incorrect way, they've approached this in an incorrect way. And so then you'll kind of do your research in a way that you think is correct. Whereas what you might do is then also kind of think, well, okay, within the literature, there are these areas which haven't been researched, so let's have a look at those. And so in order to do that, though, you need to really have a good understanding of what everyone else has said about everything. So that's kind of then the next step after you've come up with your idea of where you want to research. Then you come up with a methodology. So for me, it was about using semi-structured interviews. So again, we can talk about that a bit more if you want. Equally, we can scale that by. And then from your method, you then draw your kind of findings, and you have a bit of a discussion about those findings, and then kind of come to a conclusion at the end of that. So, broadly speaking, that's kind of the research life cycle, and then that will be applicable across lots of different areas of research.
Okay. Well, yeah. So let us know. What did you learn, or how did you go through it? Please continue. I've got loads of questions maybe at the end.
Sure, fantastic. Okay, cool. So, the literature review, which was the first step I did. As me and Rob were discussing a little bit at the start of the show, before the show started even, there's not a huge amount of literature that's been written about the tabletop wargaming hobby, but there was some, and it kind of gave me a nub of something to build upon in my research. So, I think the first thing that was kind of apparent from the literature is that the experience of the hobby isn't homogenous. We know this, that some people are really into the kind of list building, the competitive side. Some people are really into the kind of painting kind of side. Some people really like the narrative and the lore. And so, even though we're all involved in the same kind of thing, we're all maybe involved in it in different ways. And that will then kind of drag you into different areas. So if you get into it through the lore and the narrative, suddenly you might get dragged into the competitive scene, let's say, for example. So there's that kind of going on. As well, the hobby kind of one of the really big things was about the way in which community existed within the tabletop wargaming hobby. So as an example, the way in which the community works is different from, say, for example, the Marvel community. So the Marvel community will be kind of watching the films, but fundamentally, the community is owned by Marvel, and Marvel kind of set the tone of that community. And people in general, you might kind of go to the films with your friends, you might go to conventions, but I dare say the typical experience of somebody who's really into Marvel films will be watching kind of by themselves or with friends, watching the films. Whereas the community that surrounds the tabletop wargaming kind of hobby is much more kind of co-created and co-constructed by the participants. So I think, to draw on some examples, if you look at the way Blood Bowl works, but the community built the game by itself in some ways, and then when Games Workshop came back, they had to work with that community that owned itself. Games Workshop doesn't own the Blood Bowl community in any significant way. Same with Age of Sigmar, same with 40k, same with 30k. The community kind of owns itself, and that's quite a big difference from some other communities around kind of some other hobbies and passions. And so literature was kind of talking about that. And there was a little bit as well in some of the literature about some different bits and pieces of literature kind of touched on how the hobby might help people who struggle with social interaction, help them to socially interact with other people. So that was kind of what I discovered. Now, what I then did in terms of kind of it's a process called problematizing the literature, but basically what that means is just finding the holes, basically finding the gaps. So the biggest gap that I found was that all of the research that had been done so far had either been done in America or France, or I think there was one in Australia as well, which is quite surprising. I think it would surprise you yourself too, because I think it's quite obvious, and there's evidence to suggest this as well, that I kind of found, that the UK tabletop wargaming scene is the biggest scene in the world, certainly in terms of density of population. Like I think when I was looking at it, there's only I think there's only about 14 more Games Workshop stores in America than there are in the whole of the UK. So, that shows that there's just much more density of Games Workshop, and there's probably more hobbyists per thousands of people. So, the fact that there was no UK-based research, despite the fact that was maybe the biggest, most established scene, was a gap.
I'd also like to just one of the things that I thought as well is that, because you pointed out that there were Games Workshop obviously is based here, and so the study not being done in the country of production I think is super weird. And like you said, but there's also been, I think, of something like the Sheffield Slaughter or Pete and Adi, who are like 1 billion years old, and you've also got a group of people there who thank you everyone for joining us live, by the way. You have a group of people there who not only have been involved in the hobby, are involved in the hobby in the home country, but they've been involved in the hobby for a very long time. So some of those developmental things that I know that is the kind of core focus of this study is, it might have had a longer time to gestate, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's really fascinating. I know also wargaming has existed for a long time. Like apparently there's a study of historical wargaming in West Point in 1920 or something like that. There's a really good book if anyone's interested called Zones of Control, which is a look at again. And we were talking off air. The actual literature or academic literature surrounding wargaming is fairly light. Normally I have to move on to things like actual military wargaming in that structure. And like you said, it's a fascinating field. It's basically all of life, but then you just apply it to wargaming, right? Which I think is one. And I really found it fascinating what you were saying about interaction. And because wargaming is an interesting one for me because I've never struggled to integrate or to socialize. I was a nightclub promoter for more than a decade. Like if anything, I used the hobby to get away from people. That's like I just want to go meet a couple of nerds who I like, not hundreds of nightclub goers. So I feel like there's a kind of an interesting swing, but I do also recognize there are people who right now need the hobby. Anyway, sorry, I'm just talking, and I'd rather hear you talk. Please continue.
Sure, yeah, and I think those are some really interesting points that we can pick up in just a wee second. But so I mean, I think you when it comes to that idea of kind of socialization and stuff, what there hadn't been in the research is any kind of analysis of the impact on individuals of being in the hobby. So beyond a kind of quite a surface level. So for example, one piece of literature. Was looking at why people did the hobby and kind of came to the conclusion, well, people do it to get maybe that sense of accomplishment, which is fine, that's cool. But, people do the hobby for kind of for much more reasons than that. And also, just because you feel a sense of accomplishment, what does that then do to you on a deeper level? Kind of, if that is the only place where you're getting accomplishments, what does that mean in terms of how you feel about yourself and your ability to kind of get on and do things? So I think that's that's something that was not covered in the literature. And I think finally as well is that there was a real naivety, I think, to the impact of the demographics of the hobby on kind of the participants and on the way in which it all kind of held together. Because I think we all know, and take one look at a tournament, any picture of any tournament in the world, certainly in the Western world. If you look at kind of, all of the box art, for example, like the new Lumineth, are all white. All Space Marines are all white men. In some ways, you might even look at the Lumineth as a real missed opportunity to kind of showcase, oh, by the way, there are ethnically diverse elves, but we missed that, unfortunately. Or Games Workshop missed that, and so it's a very, very white male hobby.
Yeah, but I do to give them their due. I agree with you, absolutely, that would be the case. But to give them their due, there is some definitely push, like Tin Donwell saying in the chat. The New Dawn book has a Black Space Marine, which I think is positive, and I have noticed a general increase in the painting of the different faces of the different characters for like stuff like Necromunda. Like I've seen a marked increase, but like I agree with you. Like, and they obviously are releasing more female-led lines as well. So like the lead time on some of that stuff takes a long time as well. So
yeah,
I understand your point, and I agree with it pretty much the whole way across.
Yeah. And I think even if the hobby itself is kind of starting to react to this, well, okay, there's loads of white men in the literature and the lore, so how can we kind of shift that direction wise? That's not then reflected in literature. So the literature is kind of in some ways quite naive to that fact. So when, for example, one piece of literature was kind of talking about how the hobby is a place for people of all backgrounds and all communities to come together and get involved and do things. There's no evidence that that's actually occurring. And of all the things that you're talking about there in terms of increased representation of different ethnicities, increase of different genders, will be helping move the dial move the needle in that respect. But at the minute, we do exist in a hobby that's very white and male, and research should acknowledge that fact.
Yeah. Like, if it's the numbers, right? Like, if it's like 98% are white and men, those are the numbers. It doesn't matter. Like, the question is, in some cases, is why, and then anyway. So, which I thought were all valid points. Like, I'm stood in a wargaming club, or like I'm doing coverage for an event. It's white fellas. Like, that's the thing. Okay. So what's next?
Sure. So, the next thing was then the kind of methodology, which it'll be quite quick for me, really. So, basically, the way I did it was semi-structured interviews. So, in some ways, it's a bit like the format of the streams that you do. So it's just kind of, I'll go into an interview with a participant, and there were 8 total participants that I interviewed. I'll go in with a specific agenda of, okay, well, this is what we're going to talk about. But if we go off on tangents, or if we kind of end up talking about something different, then that's absolutely fine, because that's reflecting the real thoughts of the participants, which is kind of what we're after in this kind of research, what I'm after. And I think as well, certainly so I'm quite a narrative career practitioner, so I really like kind of stories and narrative, because there's lots of evidence to show that storytelling is a way to make meaning. So as an example, say you're stuck in traffic, you might say you were stuck in traffic for 20 minutes. You might get home and say, oh, I was stuck in traffic for hours and hours and hours, and it was really frustrating. And what you're doing there is you're not necessarily getting across a true account of the facts. You're trying to get across your frustration that you were feeling with that particular situation, that particular scenario. And storytelling is a way to do that. So I wanted to have a research method that was encouraging storytelling, because, if the community is owned by its participants, I'm getting a real sense of the worldview of those owners, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand that completely. I think actually storytelling is maybe the key component of the Warhammer community. Like I see that in all of the ways, like how you painted the model, how you fought the battle, who you played against. It just seems to be such a key tenet, or it's something I've started to really appreciate over the past, maybe even only the past year, to understand that level of storytelling that does drive everyone and what we do. And I loved what you said at the start of your paper. Is that what I'm calling it? I'm sorry if that's wrong.
Yeah, fine.
The bit about quests and how people group and get together to enact these quests and be a part of a thing. And I read that and I was like, and the socialization that is occurred because of it. And I don't want to ham-fist it, so if people get the opportunity to read it, I'll let them read it. But I thought that was fascinating. It made me think, oh yeah, that is what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, as one paper compared it to like a medieval pilgrimage kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Like, you and a group of mates go together to defeat the monsters, which is the other guys playing Warhammer, and then you come out as the victor, and it's all storytelling. It's fascinating. I was like, oh my god, amazing. Okay. Yeah, so what did you start to discover, or what, like, I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but
sure. So, there's kind of 5 broad themes. So I think if we go for the biggest ones first in terms of the amount of evidence and kind of what I found. So I think the top one, and I think, it will surprise nobody, the top thing was socialization. So socialization is just a kind of fancier word of saying, talking to people, being social, kind of getting involved in those kind of social conversations. And that was one of the really key things, is that by doing the hobby, people felt they were able to kind of relate to other people. So as an example, several people described it as like a structured conversation. So, typically, and this happens quite a bit, you might not know the person who you're playing, but the game itself gives you a structure around which to build a conversation. So, you might, for example, start off with discussing, okay, well, what are the missions? Laying some ground rules. So, for example, as you've described several times, if any dice touch the terrain, I re-roll those dice. You've got your kind of structured way of approaching that kind of game, and it kind of then eases you into larger conversations maybe about kind of like, oh, what do you do, and stuff like that. So that kind of common ground it gives you will give you that ability to kind of learn to talk to people. And I think as well, we've all come across those situations where the way in which you typically communicate different to the way in which the person you're playing against will typically communicate, and you have to learn and adapt to their particular style, just as they're learning and adapting to you as well. So you kind of have to learn and be empathetic in that way. I think as well, learning to kind of empathize with the people about their kind of passions and stuff like that. And I think one of the really big things actually was about kind of resolving disputes and negotiations. So, and that all kind of comes under the socialization umbrella. So, as an example, if you come to a rules disagreement with somebody else, you've then got a process through which you can resolve that dispute. So, first things first will be, okay, well, let's return to the rule books, and we'll read the rule books, make sure we read those rules. If there isn't anything there, let's check the FAQs. And then if that hasn't resolved it, then let's roll it off. So there's that structure around that dispute. And, and I think as well, it's occurring in a really low stakes environment. So one participant described it as a bit like a social gym. So in a gym, you could have somebody who is training, to lift the heaviest thing they can. So they're training for like a strongman competition. So in that gym, they can go there and learn to train with the same machines for that strongman competition. Somebody else can go into that gym and they might have had a really severe accident and they're learning to walk again. So they are going in there to learn to walk again. And they're both using the same equipment, the same, in some ways, maybe even doing some of the same activities, but they're getting really different things out of it. And I think it's the same here. So let's take your example. You were kind of using a hobby as a way to get away from people and maybe kind of have a bit more of a relaxed social environment than you were used to. And so that was developing your social skills in that direction. Whereas for myself, before I was into the hobby, I was a massive introvert. I was very shy. The idea of doing something like this or talking one-to-one with a student or kind of doing a group work or a lecture or anything like that would have terrified me. Whereas like now it's kind of almost second nature. So what it's providing you with is a structure and a low stakes environment in which you can engage in those kind of social conversations, if that makes sense.
Yeah, loads, absolutely loads. I completely see exactly what you mean, and I've also seen the development in not only myself, my friends, or people who I've gamed with for a long time. I do have a question for you. So when I was reading about it, I wasn't 100% certain on what socialization meant. I know what interacting means and being social means, but could you give me what's a good example of or if I'm getting better at socialization, what am I doing better? And if I'm not good at socialization, where am I at? Is the kind of sliding scale, I guess.
Sure. So, I mean, on a really simple level, so on a socialization is just, as I say, it's just a kind of fancier way of describing the kind of interaction with the people. So the kind of, I mean, I just quickly Googled it just to make sure I wasn't talking out my arse. But, and the first result is the activity of mixing socially with others. So, it's just, in some ways you don't need a term. Academic stuff is kind of, you've got to use the academic language in some way. So I probably could have just said social mixing or talking to other people or being social in the same place as I was talking about socialization. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And before we go any further, we've got quite an involved question here from Gitley, so I'll ask it just before we jump on. I'd like to know a little bit more about the qualitative research and the 8 people interviewed. So we're not going to be talking about the 8 people interviewed specifically. I'd like to know that. Were they all receptive or active in the hobby? Were they proportionally representative of the current demographic? And was there any qualitative or quantitative data gathering about the people's view of the hobby who are not within the hobby and maybe for a demographic we all speak about when they say we need to make it more gender cultural backgrounds?
Sure.
That makes sense?
Yes. So I think there were several questions in there. I'll try and answer them. I'll try and remember them. So the first one was about the demographics of the participants. So there were 8 different participants. To be a part of the research, they had to self-declare that they had been involved in the hobby for at least 5 years, and all of them had been involved in at least kind of 20, 15 years kind of thing. So they were all hobbyists with kind of a long pedigree, as it were. I think exploring the perspectives of people who weren't in the hobby would have been really interesting. But this research project was quite a small project. I only had about 5,000 words, and the more perspectives you're bringing into that, the more the less words you've got to fully realize all of the research that you're doing. So absolutely, yeah, I think that would be a really interesting kind of area to explore, 100%. But I didn't explore that in my own research. And there was another question as well in there, I think.
I think it was, were they proportionally representative of the current demographics was one,
Sure.
and then there was a longer one.
Yes, yeah.
We just asked that.
So yeah, they were all white men, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
Because, I mean, the reason for that is because, the hobby is very, very white and male. So, without going to too much into depth about how you kind of pick out your research sample, there's a variety of different ways. And what I wanted to do was get a typical research sample. So let's get as many typical hobby blokes in the room as possible, and talk to them, rather than trying to deliberately seek out
the
fringe
outliers.
cases, extreme cases, because then suddenly it's a bit like rolling the dice, right? So if every time you roll a dice, you don't want to roll a 1, because a 1 would be a participant who isn't representative of the community. If you roll a dice 8 times, you're likely to get a 1, but you're also likely to get lots of other results to kind of show you that 1 is an anomaly. Whereas if you've only got one example of a particular characteristic, let's say, when you roll that dice, you might get that 1 and you don't know it's a 1. You might think it's a 3, 4, or whatever the case may be. You don't know it's that outlier. So, it was very much a case of trying to get as many typical participants as possible.
Yeah. Another great question in the chat was, were 2 of them Twitter trolls to make it representative of the demographic? So, okay, you can slide on from that. So I'd be really interested to hear, like, if you've got any questions, Ziggy, I know you've got one about, like, the methodology later. We'll try and get around to them, but I'd like to hear about what you think you found so far. And again, I'd like to prefix that, like, I understand that this is, like, the computer game industry, because it makes billions now, has had nothing but research thrown at it by social scientists and other people, really, so that it can be fed to marketers and sold to make us spend more money. That's generally the process. But I also think, obviously, if you look at, like, the sheer volume increase in Warhammer that's happened over the past 4 years, the sales obviously skyrocketed. You've got all sorts of big investment groups looking at tabletop wargaming generally, so it's a fascinating field anyway. So it makes sense that there's started to be some academic look at it as well, right? So I'm sure there'll be more of this in the future. So yeah, what did you discover? Like, what did you start to find out?
Sure. So yeah, there was a socialization kind of point, and I think one of the key things, and as we come on to skill development, which was the kind of next area, is that really it's a safe space to learn to do something. So in the case of the people I was talking to, in that particular example, it was a safe space to learn how to talk to other people and socialize with other people. In other cases, it might be, if we move on to kind of skill development, it's a safe space to learn. I kind of came up with several different skills that people were learning from the hobby. So, and again, they won't be surprising, I think, to lots of people. So I'll kind of just list them out as they came up. So there was English and maths, which I think is really obvious. There's negotiation and communication, kind of fine motor skills as well. So as an example, one participant, they did a lot of work with kind of plug sockets and wiring plug sockets, and kind of other kind of engineering kind of tasks. And they were able to arrive into that situation having had a really low stakes. So, if you mess up building a Warhammer model, that's kind of on you. And, it doesn't matter at the end of the day. And same with kind of if a negotiation doesn't go your way in a war game, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But you've been able to practice and learn that you're able to negotiate that and learn how to do that. So it's the same with these fine motor skills. So the fact that they'd spent a lot of time building and painting really fiddly models then meant that when they came to like wiring a plug, they actually found that they had something to draw upon when it came to then using that skill in a kind of professional environment. And kind of other kinds of skills we were talking about was kind of research. So, understanding kind of conflicts and understanding how to build and paint models. So, we've all come across models where the instructions maybe aren't quite what you would hope for. And so you have to kind of go through that process of researching online and researching it on YouTube and stuff about how you build a particular model. And all of these different things that I'm describing here are things that you have a chance to practice in quite a low stakes environment that you can then draw upon when you move into a higher stakes environment. So say at work. So if you're negotiating at work around, we've all come across scenarios. And again, a participant particularly described this of a time when you're talking to somebody and they have got completely on the wrong end of the stick. They have no idea what they're talking about. So you have to find a way. They're basically sat there saying black is white, and you're saying no, white is white. And if you've never negotiated with somebody who completely has an opposite opinion from you before, you might really come unstuck there. But if you've gone through that process in a war game of kind of going, well, okay, I can sit here explaining my position for as long as I like, but it's not going to convince you. What we need to do is we need to look at the rules, we need to look at the FAQs, maybe we just need to roll a dice for it, these kinds of things. These kinds of strategies that you would deploy in a war game. If you've never had a chance to practice that, you're not going to know that exists as a strategy for negotiation. Whereas with if you're a tabletop wargamer, you have actually experienced that. So if you come across a situation in the workplace, you've got experience that you can draw on to go through that kind of process of negotiating with somebody. And really that is, I think that and socializing and talking with people, those two things I think are probably the most significant parts of the hobby in terms of giving people a chance to in terms of kind of impacting people's career development.
I couldn't agree with you more. Like, I actually think that, so when I was a very young man, so just an anecdotal story, so when I was 18 and I've been doing a lot of martial arts, but I wasn't a very confident to talk to people kind of man in the way that I wanted to just say no and it just be to have some sort of forthright nature about myself as a person. And so I decided to become a doorman as a way a way to earn money, because it was my secondary job at that point, but it was my way to learn to interact with people in a way that I could be confrontational, but not aggressive, not confrontational as in I want to fight you, as in, and to de-escalate situations. So I intentionally put myself into this job to learn what I thought were necessary life skills to communicate and converse with people, because that's what good doormen, by the way, are excellent at that. They're excellent at conflict resolution, de-escalation, and management of people. That's what they're there for, and drunk people beside. And so when I get into wargaming and I see these people who, because there's such a misconception that wargamers aren't very communicative people. And actually I find the opposite to be true. They're normally crystal clear on intent, or over time they start to develop the ability to be more crystal clear on intent, understanding, conversation. So maybe that's also why I ran away from the club environment to go play war games. So I was like, it's just all these people who are really good at communicating with me. It was like we were like, do we understand the frameworks? Like, yeah, we do. I'm like, oh, awesome. We're all together on this. And there was very little of that conflict that I actually encountered. Just thinking about it now, that's my anecdotal stuff, FYI.
Yeah, but absolutely, yeah. And I think that was a really common experience. Kind of in the hobby. So the way in which you described that process of kind of effectively you identified a skill gap in yourself. So you decided, actually, I don't have those conflict resolution skills, so I want to put myself in a situation that enables me to develop those skills. The hobby is kind of doing that naturally, and even to a kind of quite extreme example. So you can. So we were talking earlier about the literature. Having different aspects of the hobby that you can get involved in, different people being involved in that in different ways. You can then kind of extrapolate that to a point where you could think, well, actually, I'm not very good at talking to large groups of people and engaging them and getting them involved in things. And if I want to advance in my career, or if I want to advance in my personal life, I need that as a skill. And you could be in that position. So you might then get involved in, for example, demo games. So in lots of the different kind of conventions all around the UK, around the world, there'll be lots of different demo games. So you might then think, well, actually, what I'm going to do is, I feel this is quite a safe environment. I know the game. I know it off the top of my head. I know all the lore. I know all the rules. I've taught people to play this game before, when people have come down the club. So what I'll do is go into this convention setting and do that, but for large groups of people, and learn that skill in a deeper way. And one participant actually did that. So they actually identified there's a gap here if I want to advance in my career. So what I need to do is use the tabletop wargaming hobby to learn that. And without the tabletop wargaming hobby, they might not have that same thing. So, if you're really into fishing, let's say, probably you'll get a lot of the benefits that we've discussed. So project management. I imagine a fishing trip, you have to think, right, where are we going to go? What kind of fish are there? What kind of bait do I need? What kind of licenses do I need? You need to do all those different things. So there's lots of skills that you're developing doing that.
A dinghy and some dynamite. That's my tactic.
Just wait for them to float to the top. And then,
while I'm chewing on some corn and sipping some blue lightning. That's my technique. But yeah, anyway, you're right.
Through that, you could develop some skills, but what's missing from the fishing hobby, let's say, is probably a lot of that social element. So there isn't maybe in the same way a baked-in social process within that hobby. So I think what's unique about tabletop wargaming actually is the fact that it combines so many different activities together, and you can then use that to bridge into other different things. So you might get in from a lore perspective and then think, well, actually, what I want to do is develop my ability to talk to other people, so I can do that within this same hobby rather than having to find a new hobby to do that. And one of the participants, and it's a quote I used in my research, if I can find it somewhere, basically kind of said, I can't think of another hobby that stimulates as much as the human mind and gives you as much to do as Warhammer. And it had only really been dawning on them at that point that they had a hobby that had so many of those different elements in there. So that was kind of the perspective of one of the research participants, and I think that's my perspective now as well. Certainly, is that the unique thing about Warhammer is that there's so many different elements that you can get involved in that just push it above. I can't think of another hobby that has this level, that can have this level of potential impact on an individual in the world.
Yeah, I agree with you. Watching people plan. I mean, you're right. I know guys who don't do in their job or in other stuff, start to project plan events, their own army, all sorts of things, and it's also true for me. If anyone is aware, I'm a terrible planner. We all know I'm not the most organized person in the world, but it's forced me to have to be so. And long-term planning. I've always been a really good short-term planner or a reactive kind of person, but I haven't been a very good long-term planner. And I would always be like, wait, you're booking an event next year in October. What the hell? That's so long away. But it started to make me be able to understand long-term planning better, which has been a positive for me. And you're right. I think that you only develop really positive skill sets from all aspects of the hobby, but identifying project planning was one of the ones that really made me think, oh yeah, everyone is fairly good at that. Or they're painting in the hotel room the day before.
But I mean, even then, you've got to have the models, you've got to have the right paints, you've got to know the amount of time that it takes. So even if you've, through maybe not the best project planning, but even if you've condensed that down into 4 hours before the thing's due to start in the fucking morning, you've still got to have an element of project planning, otherwise you're not going to be successful.
Yeah, it's a great question in the chat. I don't think this will be the case, but there is obviously those people, and I know. So one of the things that I've actively done on this show consistently has been go to events. Obviously with COVID, go to safe COVID events, but get out there and go meet people, go play at events. And consistently, the feedback I've had from people is, "Oh, I went to my first event and I had an amazing time." And then I tend to see the guys in the chat less because they're now forming friendships, they're doing things, they're going out there, which I think is wonderful, and I think it's really, really good. A question from Born Again Manchild is, did he explore people who maybe don't break out the anxiety or social anxiety and stay within a very small gaming circles, or maybe stick to the law of building and painting instead of going out there and gaming?
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. So I think there's two answers to that. I think the first is some of the participants brought that up actually, of kind of saying there will be some examples of people who say you're quite introverted and you're not necessarily that well to be social. You might end up congregating around effectively lots of people who are similar to you in that respect, and if you then do that from 12 to 20 or those really important developmental years, you probably won't get the same level of impact as maybe somebody who gets involved in, with lots of different people who are quite different to them in some ways. So I think that's a really fair point. I think as well that point around, what of those people who typically, well, maybe just have the law, like they don't care about anything else. They know the game exists, but they're not interested in that. They probably won't have the same impact at all from that. So I think certainly the research that I did suggests that people tend towards larger communities as things go along. So as an example, one participant was started off playing in their garage with a work colleague, and then when that work colleague fell out of the hobby, they then had to go and look for communities online to do that. They want to continue in the hobby. So people are tending towards larger communities, people are tending towards that. So I hope that answers the question.
It does.
But I think there will be examples of people who just never make that jump.
And again, if you know one of those people or are one of those people, I actively encourage you to go to an event or actively try to encourage those people to do this. I only see it as a positive. I really do.
Yeah,
and when there is and when there is new people at events, you should try your hardest to just make that little bit more accommodation for those people as well. And I know because that's the thing about the hobby or the people in it. When I'm at an event, that's all they're trying to do. It's like, are you new? Yeah. Do you want to go to the bar? It's like, be your friends, which I think is really good. Okay, were there any other key points?
Well, I think kind of the one of the big things was about kind of that kind of community kind of stuff. So I think you touched on that quite a bit just then. But I think so without going into lots of unnecessary detail, there's a theory called community interaction theory, and that is basically exploring how a community impacts on the career development of one individual. And there's kind of different areas in which someone might be interacting with that community. So that'll be kind of in support and information as well as feedback. So feedback would be people telling you kind of what you're like. So as an example, there was one participant who was going through a period where they needed to find a job, and they brought that up in the research, and they were kind of explaining about how people were sending them jobs saying, "Oh, you'd be good for this." Now, finding jobs that are that person could apply for, and that's really good. But also, what that's doing is affirming to that person, by the way, I think you can do this job, and you're capable of this job, and getting that kind of really affirming message from somebody else can have a really positive impact on somebody and make sure that they can kind of find that. I think in some ways it's almost comparable to the community around a church. So if you think about like a church community, like my grandma's part of a church community. So, if she hasn't been for a couple of weeks, they'll kind of maybe write her a letter, or maybe someone will go and visit her and say, is everything okay? Do you need anything from the shops, anything like that? If somebody kind of becomes jobless, they might help them kind of find another job. They might know people through the church who have that industry, so are in the same industry as them. So the church will act like that community, and that's missing from a lot of people's lives. Whereas actually, I think that the hobby community really functions in quite a similar way to that typical church community. And so we've all been in that situation. So a friend of mine got coronavirus during this whole thing, and we were obviously really worried about them, and but we were supportive of them through it. We were making sure they got bits and pieces of food, and as well as we raised some money for them as well. So when they kind of got out of hospital with after having coronavirus, they had some kind of money to come back on, and that might not have existed if they hadn't had that community that they developed through the hobby. So I think the community itself is more than just the game and more than just talking about hobby. There's a lot of element around kind of people supporting each other and helping each other out.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's one of the really important parts, especially for those community leaders who, whether they be content creators who are community leaders in their own right and do develop communities under themselves, or it's TOs who also, or like club organizers, etc. There's somewhere there's some sort of top-down like community development, which I think is always really, really positive. I think there's also a key point in those communities and how those communities develop, in that effectively these people, if you just interact online, there's a certain level of disconnect, I think, that's always going to exist. However, when these communities do eventually integrate, which I think is CanCon's a really good example of a bunch of communities integrating from across the Australian country and then getting together. And I always find that really positive, because any sort of like friction that could exist between those communities online normally tends to be kind of like broken down at an event such as CanCon, because people end up playing each other, or they have a good laugh, or they have a beer outside, or whatever the situation might be. And for me, I see that as a really positive space, and it's why I yesterday, and I will continue to do so, advocate for those communities being very welcoming places and being as correct and open and unbigoted as they can be, because you're going to just keep introducing more people into that environment that way, which is a positive. That's what I'm trying to say. Unlike computer games, because I was having this conversation last night, unlike computer games where it's just always mostly online, in this you're definitely going to meet someone. You have to be a better person, because we socialize more.
Absolutely, yeah. I remember a piece of research that was done. So it's not related to tabletop wargaming, but what they did was they did some research both online and face to face in terms of what do you think about immigration, and so by and large, so it was basically rating immigration out of 10, and by and large the UK as a whole was about 5 or 6 out of 10 once you averaged everything out. Now, and that was the same on the internet as it was in person, but when you looked at the data, the polarization, so online, the majority of the results were either 1 or 10. So either immigration is 10 out of 10 or immigration is 1 out of 10. Whereas in person, face to face, most people were kind of rating it 5 or 6 out of 10. So I think what that's showing is that online discourse is much more polarized than face to face discourse, and how people, so the loudest voices online are often not representative of the overall majority, and often more likely to be extreme than the overall majority. And I think you'll get that same thing with Warhammer. I think that's a key difference between Warhammer and computer games, is because computer games, you are just interacting online, and you do tend to get the push towards extremes that I think we've all seen it online. Whereas face to face, you don't get that same push towards extremes. And so I think, as you say, with that common ground that you have, I think it just makes for a social experience and that kind of community developing experience that can then let somebody know, oh, by the way, that social thing that you were really afraid of doing and you didn't think you could do, you could absolutely do that. You've just spent 4 hours with another stranger who you've never met before, talking to them and having a good game with them, and then someone could then apply that to their own personal life. So that would then give them a confidence in being able to do that outside of the hobby setting.
Yeah, loads of sense. And Age of Sedmar makes a really good point in the chat. I think that's the best thing about tournaments. No matter what your gaming group, it becomes a bit cliquey, even with the best of intentions. It's inevitable. But the tourney forces you out of that bubble. And also because you normally do that as an individual. Like, I have to then play another individual. There was a quote, I think, from your research, which I found that was great. It was like, I have to now spend 3 hours with another person. Like, I have to learn to socialize, interact, and negotiate with them for 3 hours. And I was like, yeah, that's what you do. And that's such a bold decision that people make. They're like, I'm gonna randomly talk to someone for 3 hours. You wouldn't, like, I can't imagine other life, like, I know there are other hobbies that are similar, but I think it's on the more unique end of the spectrum. I do feel. So was there anything else?
I'm just trying to think. I think there's I'm conscious that we're kind of running out of time a little bit here. I think there was one thing I think that I think I'll touch on in depth. Was this idea of the wargaming community being a bit like, so one of the participants compared it to Eton and Harrow. So Eton and Harrow are the posh schools where all the posh people go, and they have a really common experience there. And so when they meet each other then in the real world, probably they would never say, oh yeah, the reason why I selected this person to be, this member of parliament or in this senior civil service job is because I knew them from Eton and Harrow. But they've got a common framework. They've had a common life experience that they've shared. And the tabletop wargaming hobby does the same thing. So as an example, people can have impacts on people's lives that they've never even met before. So one of the participants was involved in recruitment, and they had somebody who basically had put in their their application form, I built an online campaign tool for Warhammer, and they hadn't explained it. And they were recruiting for a web developer role. And that's exactly the kind of thing that a web developer would find really useful. But because most of the recruiters had no idea what that meant, they weren't able to understand the skills that were associated with that particular thing. And similar, so the participant was then able to kind of go in and say, I know what this means. This is what they did. And so then the rest of the panel were like, oh, wow, that's exactly what we want. Fantastic. And so you might have, someone might have an impact on your career, or you might have an impact on someone else's career who you don't even know or might not have ever met before, just through those kinds of things. So, it's like an old boys club that suddenly you're a part of, but, it doesn't have the kind of access to power in the same way.
So it's like the Freemasons, right? Like, your dad was a Freemason. He introduces you to like the collective. Like, it's like Barry. He's like, it's someone. It's nepotism, kind of. Where, and I've always said this. It's never really what you know. It's who you know is kind of is the key element of that. And when you do enter into the wargaming community, you do start to know, because I know what people, not only who people are, but I know what they do. And that kind of interaction, like Nathan's in like 18 people's gardens a week, like fixing a fence, putting up some guttering, whatever that might be. And I'm sure his involvement in what we've done has led to many people hire him to do all sorts of building jobs, which is good. So there's a good example of what that is. So I can see that is like, and Chris in the chat, he's a chippy. Just realised one of my socks is inside out, just to bring the academic IQ down a bit. Thanks, Chris. Appreciate that loads.
Well, I can confirm my socks are odd, but they're both the right way around.
Okay, all right. And then also, Yes Me Paul says, if you want to apply to work at Brewdog, mention Warhammer. My friend is currently trying to turn the whole company into players. I find that interesting. Yeah, go on.
Oh, sorry, that was it. It was just amazing. Yeah, it's exactly stuff like that. As I say, it's that old boys club. You went to Eton too. Fantastic. Here's the job.
So are you suggesting we can all get some sort of Warhammer rings that we wear and then the special Warhammer handshake?
Absolutely, yeah. I'd be so down for a Warhammer handshake.
Same. It's like we do like a W, like this. This is like, we just do this when we see each other. You guys can't see this, but anyway.
I can't see you either.
You can't see that.
I've been staring at my own face the whole time.
Anyway, so it's been fascinating. Are we allowed to read this? Am I allowed to link it in the or is it going to be published somewhere?
No, there's no real plans to publish it. Yeah, no problem. If you want to share it somehow.
Okay, all right. And then and like we said,
just to double check though, I did send you the one without the full transcript, so yours should be 14 pages.
You did.
Cool. Okay. Cool.
You
Yeah,
did.
if it was the one with the transcripts, then I couldn't. But,
Yeah, well, so, and then also, you think, and we said this off air, that there is room and scope, and probably will be in the future, a lot more research generally done into all of this, right?
absolutely, yeah. I think so the research will exist if there are researchers interested in doing it. That's kind of on a really fundamental level. That's kind of where we're at. I don't know why there's not been a massive interest in research kind of in this particular area. I think I can't remember if we were talking about it on air or off air, but I think the more players that get involved, the more money that gets involved, the larger everything becomes. I think the more likely it is that we're going to see more research in this area. I mean, me personally, I've got dreams to do a PhD within the next 10 years. So, and I can only imagine that this will be an area that I'll be really interested in covering. So, I myself might do some more research, particularly some of I've forgotten the name of the person it was, but, maybe kind of bringing in other people's perspectives. So those kind of maybe the minority groups, or maybe some people who aren't in the hobby, kind of maybe exploring why they're put off it and what they think about it, and how maybe there's a difference in opinion between the people who are involved and the people who aren't involved.
Yeah, and also I think the thing that you identified really interestingly at the start was how that applies to different fandoms. If you take Marvel, where Marvel fans don't really have ownership, they just give in more stuff, but Warhammer fans
absolutely have
ownership of that. And I think also the company, to many degrees, it encourages that self-ownership to a lot of ways. Sometimes it's detriment, but I do think it's interesting. Thank you to Olm, by the way, for subscribing, and for everyone for joining us live. So if I'm okay to include your Twitter handle and also your the documentation in the show notes?
Yeah. I mean, so obviously people are welcome to follow me on Twitter. All you'll get from me on Twitter is centrist takes, whereas so my Instagram is probably the best place to get me for hobby stuff.
Okay, well,
that's where I put all my hobby.
Well, you can send me that, and I include that in the show notes. How does that sound?
Perfect. Yeah, no worries. But yeah, as I say, people are welcome to follow me on Twitter, but I don't think you'll get much Warhammer.
Okay, all right, good. Well, I really, really enjoyed, fascinated by this, and I think it's some of the best stuff I've done, which has mean zero to me. I've just let you talk, basically. I've done nothing, but it's wonderful having you on. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I hope people find it interesting. It's one of those things, isn't it, where I spent about 3 months working on this, so you learn it inside out, but in some ways you're kind of not sure what other people's level of interest is in it, because I'll get a mark back for it, but that's more kind of marking my research technique rather than how interesting that was. So yeah, hopefully people found it interesting.
Yeah, no, I find it fascinating. And I encourage everyone to read it. I really, really do. I didn't feel smart enough to read it, but I read it anyway. And I learned loads of big words, which was always really positive for me. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you to everyone who joined us live. I want to say big love to all you guys. And I want to say thank you to everyone on the honest-wargamer Patreon and everyone on the podcast. Couldn't do any of this without all of you. So you guys are just brilliant. So thank you so much. Have you got any shout outs, Alistair, before we head out today? Anyone you want to big up in the hobby?
So I guess the first shout out is kind of everyone. So I think, if there's one key message that people can take away from this chat, is that the hobby's been super beneficial for their development as a person, and their it will have given them skills that they're not necessarily aware of. So I think a lot of people are maybe reluctant to put hobby stuff on their CV, hobby stuff on their application forms, but actually there's a lot you can draw on. And so, feel free to use that in examples and use that in applications. So I think if there's one thing people can take from this, is that the hobby's been beneficial to their career, and they should definitely talk about it in applications and in job interviews and stuff.
Okay, no, I agree. Because you never know. I was once in a little bit of an anecdote again. I was in the airport flying back from maybe Nova, maybe LVO. I can't remember which. And we went up to the counter, and I think maybe I was running Games Search. I can't remember, but we're flying back anyway. And one of our bags overweight, and the guy who served us, he was like, you Games Workshop guys? It's like, yeah, it was like blood for the blood god, and then our bags just immediately were just sent through. Yeah, and I was like, because you're right, it's a network.
Bags to get on the plane at that point, don't you?
Yeah.
They're not
Yeah, it's definitely a network. Anyway, you guys are brilliant. Thanks for joining us live. Thank you so much to you, Alistair, and thank you, everyone. And see you soon. Goodbye.